So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on our talk on women's leadership in the peace movement and specifically in Palestine. We have three amazing Palestinian women with us today on our panel. We have Rawan Odeh, who is the Executive Director of New Story Leadership, a group that brings young Israeli and Palestinian women to Congress, or men and women, excuse me, to Congress, amongst many other projects, which I'm sure she'll tell you about. We have the Executive Director, Co-Executive Director of Combatants for Peace, Rana Salman, with us today. And we have the Regional Director of ALLMEP, Huda. I don't want to mispronounce your last name. Oh, she's muted. Ask to unmute.
Abuarquob, but you don't have to worry about it. Thank you, Habib.
So to start, I just wanted to ask the three of you if you could share personally what it is for you to be a woman in this field, and how that's impacted you, what your personal experience is with all of it.
I will give the stage to the younger generation. I'm 50. I just celebrated my 51st year old 2 days ago or 3 days ago. So Rawan and Rana, take the lead.
Happy birthday.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Beth, that's such an, it's a question I think that we ask ourselves a lot, like what it's like to be in this field as women. I think back to my 16-year-old self in a Palestinian school during religion class when my religion teacher was teaching us about the Islamic Inquisition and the political dynamics that were led during the Prophet Muhammad time. And she kept referring to male pronouns, like every time she was referring to the leaders. And I remember sitting in my seat and feeling so uncomfortable to the point I raised my hand and I said, look, you need to stop using men, only referencing men when it comes to politics, because women have power too, and we need to be involved. And I remember she said to me, no, you're going to be too busy raising the next generation. It's not really your place. And I feel like when I'm in this space, in the work that I do, I get that. I get that where people are like, oh, you're like 30, you're under 30, you're a Palestinian and you're a woman. What are you doing in this room on Capitol Hill or at the embassy? And I take that as strength, honestly, because I'm like, if I'm not here, then where are our voices? And I think the idea of empowerment and women, us as women being in the field, comes from a place of like, we're 50% of the demographic, and yet we're nowhere near that representation when it comes to rooms where our futures matter the most. So to me, when I walk in a room on Capitol Hill, I always tell myself that I am one, but I stand by the 10,000 women in the generations behind me who fought for me to have the possibility to speak up and share my story and advocate for my people. And I think there's a uniqueness in that. So it's hard, it's challenging, and it's also unique. And if we're not there, then our representation isn't portrayed. Rana, what is it like for you?
Thank you, Rawan. It's actually very challenging and surprising also, especially that working in the mostly male dominant field, especially in the activism world. But for example, lately we have been seeing a lot of images of girls and women, especially in the confrontations happening in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem with the evictions of the families, and seeing a lot of women participating in the clashes. And we feel very inspired to see them. And we share these images on our social medias and we feel very proud of them. But like some comments have actually got my attention, commenting that as if this was like a new phase in the Palestinian struggle. But it's actually not new, because Palestinian women were always in the front lines in the Palestinian struggle towards the freedom. And I'm glad that today Huda will be speaking a little bit about the history of the Palestinian women in the resistance movement in Palestine. This legacy that continues until today. It's true that still until this moment, sometimes when I walk into a room, maybe I'm the only woman in the room, and sometimes even if there were women, we are still few, and we feel significantly that we are a minority. But I feel like sticking out can be a positive attitude, because we can leave a lasting impression and they can remember us. So thank you. This is how it's like for me today.
Thank you, Rana Habibti and Rawan. I'm so proud of both of you, and I'm very honored to be on this panel with you guys. I want to say Masal Khair, hello, salam to the Combatants for Peace gang. It's important that we acknowledge the fact that this is a panel that is being created by a great team at Combatants for Peace. And I want to point out that Combatants is one of 145 organizations that under the umbrella of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. And I had the honor of working with them on the first project that has to do with women leadership in the field, early on 2014, 2015. It's important to acknowledge the personal story here. For me, doing this work is not a luxury. It's actually pushing myself out of my comfort zone and going against the social norms where women should just seek some kind of education that gets them to a place where they can marry and then have kids and raise the kids. Nothing against it. Raising kids in this environment is actually a huge task, and a chapeau to all the women who chose to take that task. Because at the end of the day, we are here today, and what we are doing is for the next generation. That's my stake in the conflict, the 33 nieces and nephews, that I want them to grow in an environment where it can give them the context where they can grow to their utmost potential and find a horizon in a place where normally people, when they look at it, they feel that there is no hope. One of these resources of hope is women. And when I look at women's history in Palestine, it's very much connected to the movement of activism and resistance. And it started way in the 20s. 1920, the first women's movement in the entire Arab world was created here in Jerusalem. I live in Hebron, but was created in Jerusalem. And it was a group of well-educated women who thought that this is the time for them to start going against the British mandate colonization at the time, and challenge some of the British mandate actions on the ground, including some of the massacres that were taking place at that time. This group got invitations to participate in different women's conferences in the Arab world, in the entire Arab world. In Egypt, in Alexandria in 1926, I think there was a meeting where the largest group of women as a delegation was from Palestine, led by women from Jerusalem. And it wasn't just only about political activism. It was also about pushing a feminist agenda. And by feminism here, I don't mean pushing men to the sea, actually partnering with men strategically, because they are partners in that crime, which is creating a space for women to have a voice. And guess what? If we actually do that, then men do not have to carry the burden of wars all the time. They can find ways in order to resolve and transform conflicts in a way that speaks to the humanity that is now on stake in our conflict. Women in Palestine strategically connected their movement to nationalism, to the nationalist agenda in Palestine. And unfortunately, I have to say that it was a strategic decision that survived them until 1948 and then 1967, the Nakba and the Naksa, where the sound of guns was more important than the sound of reason. And women needed to push back their feminist agenda and their rights, their call for full rights, under the carpet, sweep it under the carpet, because we now have a more existential threat that we need to engage in. The biggest setback that happened to women, in my opinion, and women's movement, in my opinion, was in the 80s, when religion became the larger container, for the lack of better expression. Sorry for the sound, it's fireworks all over Palestine today. It's not 4th of July, but it's the diploma, the end of the high school diploma celebrations. And boy, our people are addicted to happiness. So they want to celebrate this. So I'm sorry if you have a background noises coming. The setback was when politics attached itself to religion as a way of doing resistance. And I remember my first encounters during the first Intifada in the 80s, when we were all women in the streets trying to bring our voice into to the fold. And then we were asked not to participate in demonstrations or participate in conferences, because that's not our place. And I have to say that at that time, internationally, the religious movement had a direct attack on women's activism all over the world, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and it was all in the effort to fight communism at that time. And that was the major setback for the Palestinian women in general. We as numbers are a little bit over 50%, and we've always thought that we are partners in the liberation movements in general, but in doing resistance by men, especially because men were absent due to actions of imprisonment, and also there was a huge wave of deportation of men who were active during that time. And so women found themselves in a place where they have to take care of the families, get education, be economically efficient to take care of the household, but also keep the feminist agenda alive and resistance alive. And unfortunately, the other setback, it was during Oslo time, when the table didn't have so many women, and the only woman at that time was part of the Palestinian delegation was Hanan Ashrawi, who now she's not even in the scene anymore. She's one of the leaders who we've felt that we can stand behind and follow her steps, but unfortunately she could not survive as one woman show in that men's gang. And the other thing is that even when women were invited, it was some sort of a number rather than a voice with a reason, because there was always a dominant agenda on the table that should not change, and women were acting like parrots. And this is the situation now. It is very, very difficult to get through some of the institutions that were created through the PLO, women's institutions, because they are very much part of the problem. One of the problems is elitism. That was also an issue in the Palestinian society. We've always referred to ourselves as Fallahi kind of community. Women are from the villages are very active. They did everything they can in order to send their daughters to education, getting better education. But then when negotiations happened, we were not there. Or if we are there, we need to speak a certain language. So what the peace building field is offering women is a different path to doing that kind of activism. And I have to say that even if we are a small group of people, still women are very active within the peace building community. They have managed to find their voices, and they have managed to create their own programs and movements. And I can tell you that each and every organization that is part of ALLMEP has a women's agenda when it comes to political activism. They invested a lot. And I have to say the leaders on that level was Combatants for Peace. They were the ones who started doing leadership programs in the political arena. We created a number of documents. One of them called FIPA, Feminist Inclusive Political Activism, in which we decided that the tent can have Hajar and Sarah and their kids in the room, rather than having just Ibrahim in the tent. And to me, this is a shift in the way we think even of the Palestinian-Israeli narrative, away, even if it's inclusive of the religious aspect of it. And in one activity I did with women, I asked them, when they hear the word God or Allah, what would be the first image that comes to their minds? And guess what was the image? A man who is normally frowning all the time, angry, unsatisfied, and in many cases very violent. And when you take that element of resiliency, which is connection with a higher power from women in a conflict zone, you leave them with nothing. And from there, the transformation happens. And the challenge for many of the women is to replace he with she when referring to God, which is very controversial, by the way. But it's women would be against using she instead of he referring to God. And the question to them at that moment is like, so you accept the fact that you are less. And this is how the world views you. And that's why you need to change, because God is genderless, is not a he or a she, and God is light. And it's about time for us to reclaim God as an asset to help us continue be resilient and build more trust relations that are based on equality for all and love for all. So I am very privileged in so many ways to get that hope. I am a hope junkie, and I only find it among women who are part of this field. Rawan and Rana are examples of it, and there are thousands of other examples. We just graduated a group of women from Combatants for Peace's partner, the Family Forum, who are now trying to lead a movement within Palestine, a feminist movement in Palestine, that would put back women's voice on the table. And in some ways, we are going to make our leaders sit on the table and speak our terms. I took too much time, but thank you so much for allowing us to bring our voice to you. Appreciate it.
Wow, I think just reflecting back in what the points that Huda said that are most moving to me is, for all of us who think back to the first Intifada, we think of the Kufiye, we think of the men that are on the streets, and when actually you break it down, it was the women. Like every single Palestinian fraction had a women's committee, and at the time it was illegal for Palestinians to go into political parties or student union groups. So actually women created groups for knitting and sewing and disguised everything that they were doing so they can organize mass protests and health strikes and work strikes and boycotts. And I think step one is like reframing our role, and that we were actually monumental in shifting things. One of the most surprising things for me that I didn't know about is that, you know, there was a Palestinian women delegation in 1991 that went to Madrid, and they started the negotiation process. They started it and had no idea that there were men in Norway going underway Oslo. And for the women in Madrid, they were like, we're not going to negotiate until the settlements stop. It was the precondition. And lo and behold, when Oslo took over, which was primarily run by Palestinian men outside of Palestine that weren't on the ground protesting, that weren't doing their nonviolent action, they took over. And the product of what we have now, people think Oslo is the greatest breakthrough to date. But what would have happened if it was women who continued to lead the Madrid negotiation process instead of Oslo? And I think with that, I want to ask Rana, what's happening on the ground in Palestine?
Thank you, Rawan, and thank you, Huda. That was really inspiring. Thank you for sharing. I would like just to give some focus about the programs of Combatants for Peace and what we have been doing for the last few years and just recently. And I'm so proud that many of our main projects and programs are actually women-led. So let me just share. I would like to show you some pictures. I would like to share my screen. 1 second. Okay. Okay, is it working for everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. So I would like to say that many of the protests and the nonviolent demonstrations that we have organized and participated at, women were always in the front lines as they were in the past. They continue to be also in the present time and not scared and raise their voices, and they are always present even in confrontations with the army. As you can see, there are so many men, and probably the women in these participations are a minority, but they stand out. They are usually in the front lines because they are protesting for something that is really important for them. The most beloved people for them are suffering, like their husbands are in jail or they lost a son or a daughter. So they are the ones who are feeling the most pain of this ongoing conflict, and that's why their voices matter. Here we had also a protest just recently in Beit Jala, very close to the junction. And you can see that some of actually our Combatants for Peace activists, mostly also women, got arrested just for protesting non-violently in these actions. Here you can also see how some of the ladies were also protecting the women during the protest and just trying to help them not to get arrested. And that's how important to be on the ground, because they are also their presence is really important, and they shift actually the way the soldiers are responding to the conflict. Here you can see some of the field activism in the ground where our supporters, our activists, female activists, they help with the planting in the areas that are being confiscated or being a conflict zone very close to the settlements. They help with the planting of olive trees and grapevines in these lands to help the solidarity and the people to remain in their lands and not to be forced to leave, and to keep it cultivated all the time. So the presence, you can see that our female activists are always working in the olive harvest campaigns, usually in the months of October and November. They are always present, and they help with the picking the olives. It's a hard work and it takes a lot of hours being in the sun outdoors. So they don't mind it, and they are always there doing what usually is a man work, but they're always there. One of the biggest events that is organized by Combatants for Peace is the joint memorial ceremony, Palestinian-Israeli memorial ceremony. And it is co-led by an Israeli coordinator and Palestinian coordinator. And here we can see Ayala. She was the Israeli coordinator of this huge actually event. And this year we had about 280,000 people watching the online broadcast of the ceremony. And due to COVID, we were able to host a small number of people in Tel Aviv, about 200. And in Beit Jala, we only had about 60 because of the COVID restrictions. Here are some also pictures from the event. Also, we started the joint Nakba remembrance ceremony this year. It's actually our second year that we arrange it. And it was also led by a female activist, Khulud. She arranged the whole ceremony with a committee, a joint committee, and it was actually very successful. And we also broadcasted online due to COVID. I hope you all watched it. And we had our activists joining together in 2 actual locations, one in the West Bank and one in Israel, broadcasting at the same time and watching it together. So this is one of the events. You can see also some of our activists in our joint meetings. The presence of the female activist is very significant. Probably this was before, like, joining female activists in this kind of movement has been a new phenomenon, for example, because when I actually joined the movement, the number of females in the movement is actually few. But it's been a process, and it has been changing over the years, and we can see that more females are joining. We also have a youth program. This is the Palestine youth program, and the leader actually of this program is Rafa, a female activist, and she just initiated this program this year, and they had several workshops going on, and it will continue until the end of the year. And it has been going so well so far. Also, we have a women committee program for females, also to support them psychologically, because what has been happening in the last year with the COVID and being at home or losing their jobs or all these kind of difficulties and struggle, it's also important to focus on our mental health and our psychological our psychological mind. And so that's one of these are several kinds of programs that we have been doing at Combatants for Peace. And sorry, I didn't share a lot of pictures, but what we have been doing on the ground is so much more than what I've been sharing so far. Thank you.
Rana, thank you so much. Combatants for Peace is really the gritty, the work where you wake up every morning and you put your life and your story and your activism where it's needed the most. I'm going to take you all into the future.
Before we do that, Rawan, can I jump in?
Go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in and say, Rana and I, as we were preparing this talk this morning, we realized between the two of us that within the movement Combatants for Peace, all of our biggest and most effective programs are women-led. So the joint memorial was women-led, the joint Nakba ceremony, women-led, the youth program on the Palestinian side, women-led, the
movement is women-led.
The movement is women-led in general. On the Israeli side, both the youth and young adult programs are women-led. Like any of our programs that you can say, oh wow, those are the programs that like really have significant impact. I think, at least, and this has been a transition in the last few years, but they're all women-led. So with that, I want to turn it over to you, Rana. Rawan, sorry.
Of course. So I'm also going to share my screen because visuals are where it's at. Just 1 second. Okay. Do you all see my screen? Okay, great. So when we were thinking about this talk and like, where do we go from here? I mean, we talked about the monumental role that women played on the ground and continue to play. And I'm going to be honest with you, with the groundwork, with the current inspiring Palestinian women that are in leadership positions in peace building, it's still not enough. It's nowhere near enough. So how do we bring women voices forward and give politics for her? First, just to frame, like we have all seen this, like COVID-19 has had a disproportionate effect on women around the world, and particularly in Palestine. Domestic violence has risen. Women have lost their jobs. It's been harder to even, the gender pay gap has even increased, and there's been so many regional political shifts in the MENA region. The Palestinian Authority has still yet to follow through with elections, so actually having a political voice has been really difficult politically. And yet there's an opportunity. And I think part of that is with the changing US administration, the changing Congress and Senate. And I'll explain to you why, but my slide won't go through. Okay, here it is. So when we look at like peace building and how we can continue to build allyship and political activism in the peace building field, there are different types of change, right? Like there's the personal change where our peace building programs work to transform Palestinians and Israelis through their internal work, self-awareness of the occupation, the structural dynamics that exist, but that always is on a personal change. And right now we still don't have the mass scale that that we need to really create monumental change through our personal change programs. And what we're really looking to have is structural change. That's where we've been stuck, like institutional shifts away from harmful structures like the PA, the Israeli military's control on Palestine. And how do we do that? Like that's the big question. Hold on, my slides totally. Okay, so to me, honestly, when I think about the future, when I think about where we can go, it's having a gendered advocacy approach. There's a feminist nonviolent activist, Barbara Deming, who says the revolution and equilibrium, asserting that activists needs two hands of nonviolence. What we've seen is that strategic nonviolent action shifts power. We've seen the Talat movement, a Palestinian feminist group that's currently working right now to end all their killings in Palestine. And we've also seen that dialogue and negotiating with adversaries works as well. But what we don't have yet is an intersectional approach where we connect the nonviolent action that Combatants for Peace is doing with the dialogue and negotiation with the peace building communities that are working to create personal change. And the big missing piece is the advocacy strategies. So honestly, the personal is the political. It's a feminist theory and it works. At New Story Leadership, we use personal stories and connect those to people who are in positions of power that can impact change. And that's where we can capitalize on the social movements that currently exist with Combatants for Peace, with Alliance for Middle East Peace, but without the advocacy, without the voice, without the platform to give women a seat at the table, we're still back with just having personal change instead of structural change. And with these advocacy strategies, it's all about the allies, right? Like, who are our allies in the peace building field? What's our network and how can we expand that? And without direct government advocacy, I think we'll be stuck in the status quo. And I think that same status quo has made thousands of activists lose hope, has made thousands of activists feel like, you know, the big normalization conversation where Palestinians go to peace building programs with their hearts filled with hope, and then they go back to the occupation and the same exact reality they left behind. So without us as women advocating for structural change and advocating to get a seat at the table, we're going to be stuck on a treadmill. And I think the only way for us to break that is to really think through the political change and giving a voice. And this is something that I do with my activists, with my She Leads Gender Lens program, is thinking, where are our active allies, right? Like for Combatants for Peace, active allies are the members of the community. You all that are on a Zoom call, you are all our active donors. And then thinking, who are our active opponents? Is it Bennett, right? Is it people in the PA who are arresting Palestinian activists on the ground? And then how can we start to shift that forward? And then finally, impact, right? Like that's where we see the successes of who we are and where we want to bring to the table. There's a resolution that the UN created called Resolution 1325. The Palestinian government has signed on it. The Israeli government has signed on it, but like, where's the concrete action in moving it forward? And I think we do that through, like I said, expanding our allies within people who have positions of power in Congress, shifting public perception through our storytelling process, and mobilizing the movement and saying, your story matters. you have a seat at the table. And I'd like to end with this saying, the first African-American Congresswoman said, they didn't give me a seat at the table, so I brought my folding chair. And that's where I want all of us to know that we have a seat at the table. We just need to think strategically in how we can influence and impact change beyond the personal transformation and into the structural dynamics that we want to break. So that's the future where we have a seat at the table. Beth, I'd like to invite you back if you to facilitate our Q&A and follow up.
Thanks, Rawan. And thanks to all three of you guys. So first, I'd invite all participants to either send questions to me. You can see in the chat box, Combatants for Peace, or send them to the send question here. So feel free to use your chat box for that. We have one question to start. So for each of you guys, what are the biggest personal lessons you've learned in your years of doing this? And could you share some advice for people who sometimes feel like they're running out of steam or energy in doing this work?
I think the asset is the strategic partnerships, but also the message itself. Once we have a seat on the table, the message matters the most. What is it that we want as women in the peace building field? What is it that we want as Israeli and Palestinian women in this conflict? And I think it's important to work very hard on strengthening that message through rigorous research. And I do believe that, just like Rawan put it very nicely, the planning, monitoring, and evaluation is really important for all of these programs so we can measure the impact. Social change is not easy, but investing in that would bring a lot of women into the fold. I cannot tell you how easy to work with women because they don't have political interests. They move the conversation from positions, interests to needs. And there the solutions and the creativity happens. And it doesn't take that much to get women leaving the room with a huge amount of energy to change. And they focus on their own communities. So what's important at this point is to move that level of grassroots movement towards advocacy. And once we do that, we need to think of the message because there are so many people out there who would just trash it for the fact that we are women leading it.
I think for me, the biggest lessons that I have learned in engaging with this work is recognizing that like there are allies out there. Like as women from Palestine, we're dealing with the occupation, we're dealing with the structural patriarchies that exist, and we're almost always on defensive mode. And I think once I shifted that mentality and realized I have allies who I can go to on Capitol Hill, within my own community, on the other side, Israeli allies, that's where you're no longer on defense, but you're in strategizing mode. And it's that my story matters. Like I'm part of the solution and my voice is valid and everyone else's voices is valid. And the final thing, lesson that Layma Gbawi actually taught me, who was a Nobel Peace Prize laureate and ended the civil war in Liberia through a women-led movement. She said, peace is not selective. Peace is a collective. And I think thinking through what we can do through that framework, that everyone needs to belong, everyone needs to feel peace, is something that I hold on in how I engage this work.
Inclusivity, Rawan. We've always mentioned that part of the issue with the peace movement in general, for a long time, it's been an exclusive club. So it's about time for us to talk to the non-believers.
Yeah.
What about you, Rana? What inspires you when things are hard? What gets you up in the morning, and what lessons can you share?
Now, I just want to say that activism and peace building, it's no longer a man's world. We're all involved in that. It's part of our life. And I think just to be successful female leaders, we just have to have the self-confidence in ourselves. And that's very important, to have the creativity, to come up with ideas, with campaigns, and just to show up and be there. And I know this kind of work takes significant effort and time, and just to make it integral with our life, not as separate, not to deal with it as a separate thing, but just part of our lives. And this is how we can succeed and move forward.
Thank you.
The most inspiring thing about us women is that we move beyond victimhood to survivorhood. And for us, the inspiration comes from there. This is a survivorhood mechanism. Being engaged is a survivorhood mechanism. And if we give up on that, then it's a lost case for everyone. So we cannot afford giving up hope and being survivors rather than victims.
Yeah, and for a long time we have been faced with this stereotype that females or like women leaders are emotional thinkers. But I came to realize that this is not a flaw, actually. This is how we are, this is how we function. And actually, I feel like this is much better way, like in the negotiations world, in the political world, and in the world of activism and peace building.
Thank you. So I'm just going to ask the questions as they've come in. So forgive me to all of you who have asked questions. I'm just going to go in order. But the first one that came in are, what are some concrete ways that men and male activists and advocates can be effective allies?
Can you repeat that question?
Sure. What are some ways that men and male activists can be effective allies in, enhancing and promotion women's leadership, liberation, and
I think for me, the number one thing is like listening. And listening not only so you can check the box, like, oh, I heard you, but I'm still gonna go ahead with whatever I think is best. Like I've been in rooms where and it's not a generalization, but there have been men who take up space, and just recognizing that like there are women who weren't raised to always have that mic and have a voice. So to me, for them to be effective allies, listen to us, believe our stories, and ask us questions instead of assuming that you know what's best for us. And also that we actually have a thing or two that we've learned as women in the field.
Participation is important. Showing up is crucial. And I think taking it to the level of family. When you raise your kids in a way that they see their daughters as equals, I think the change happens there. But also, if there is any chance you guys get to bring your voice in, always make sure that women's voices is included. Just like with any other liberation movement, equality is important, diversity is crucial.
For me, I feel like sometimes it's hard to build like a support network of a male dominant world. But it's very important not to feel that we are in a competition. Like when we come together, it's important to seek their advice and their counsel and just build this kind of connection to work together, not just to feel that we want to overcome you or that we are who is better. Like we want to work together in order to achieve our goals. So we're not a competition.
Yeah. So the next question is going to be a grouping of a couple questions. We had a couple of, in a similar manner to that question, we had a couple of Jewish women reaching out and saying, how can we be effective allies? Israeli women, Canadian, and American. So across the gamut, but how can Jewish women be effective allies for Palestinian women? And just to summarize one of the questions, especially when it's really hard to share in your own communities and get through about Palestinian human rights. Is there a way to have these conversations in a productive way? And how can Jewish women around the world be effective allies for Palestinian women? Sorry, that was like 4 questions all combined into one. So.
I think for me, I mean, Israeli women, American women, Canadian women have access to their governments. And like, part of what I talked about is the influence that political leaders have in Palestine, Israel, like for Palestinian women, our future is not only dictated by the Palestinian Authority, it's also dictated by US foreign policy, Canadian foreign policy, and the Israeli government. So you can be allies by engaging in your stakeholders in your government and saying, you know, I want to take a stand with my Palestinian women allies against the occupation. I want you to think about the funding sources that you're giving to the Israeli army. And I think that's the most powerful allyship that I can see in also taking up that space. And when I think about what's going on right now in Palestine with the PA's police brutality, like there are ways in which Jewish women, American women, Israeli women can protest where we will be arrested, where our lives will be in danger. So where there's a protest, show up and be there, because for us, it can literally, can sometimes mean our life.
I would say that the first thing that you need to do as people in diaspora is engage in conversations with Palestinians in diaspora. Try your best to do that engagement to end the polarization over Israel and Palestine. So for women in Palestine and Israel to find a space to bring their rights agenda forward. And I would say a little bit, you know, something controversial. Sometimes your support, visible support, could be one of the reasons why our voices are not heard in Palestine. I think it's the Palestinian women's fight, and it's internal. And most of the times when there is an intervention that is shaped by foreign agendas, it's always used against us. So the support that you can do is to promote Palestinian, Israeli women's work, leadership work, training for women. But if the Palestinian women are leading a fight on the ground here, one of the ways to support it is to give them the space to do it on their own and believe that they have the capacity to do it on their own. And instead of, I totally understand the reasons behind wanting to support Palestinian agenda, but sometimes it could backfire because this is the context we are operating in. And I do appreciate the fact that you guys have an access to American policymakers, and this could be one talking point when you do advocacy on the Hill, that the Palestinian women need to be independent and we need to give them the training to be independent.
Thank you. That was, I think you both included everything. I just want to say that we have been working in this joint work, Israelis and Palestinians together, and this is a very important thing to support, especially at this time. And it's actually challenging, and it continues to be challenging, like to have Israelis, Jewish people with the Palestinians together in meetings. Sometimes it's also a risk, especially because we've been always like attacked by PDS movements or being accused of being normalizers, or the Israelis being accused of being traitors. So it is very important to feel the support also from in the international community about these kind of efforts that we are doing in this region, and to support these kind of programs and projects, and so that we can continue and not feel that we're isolated in this work. And thank you.
Thank you. So I think we have time for maybe one more question. And I apologize for all the questions that we didn't get to. I'm really sorry. But what message would you have? One person put in that her girls are 4 and 7, and others, you know, many people on the call have grandchildren, granddaughters, or children and daughters. What message would you have for us and our families going forward? What if you could share one critical piece of information for the next generation and the next generation of women leaders? What would it be?
First of all, that there are women who are doing the work now, and the new generation is going to be standing on the shoulders of the women who are doing this work now. So a huge thank you and recognition of these women. On any Shabbat dinner or Friday lunch or any gathering, always bring women's stories from the region. That's why we need this rigorous research that documents these stories, because literally in the mainstream media, we have no space. So the more you bring stories from the region about women who are doing the fight to give a better path and future for the next generation, this would be a huge learning moment, but also a good example to follow in the future. I cannot stress enough the importance of rethinking religion when it comes to women. Anyone who has that capacity to start a conversation about God and women, and for me, I do that all the time, created a program called Hakima, the Wise Woman, and we reclaimed women's stories in the three traditions, and they are amazing stories. And it's about time to start doing midrash and sermons on women's stories in these books. Whether we like it or not, God is still part of the narrative, and we need to reclaim a feminist God at some point.
Thank you, Huda, for that. That's beautiful and important. I think for myself, when I think of a 4-year-old or a 7-year-old girl wanting inspiration, or wanting to see light at the end of the tunnel, I would say, you know, my mind just goes back to a Gazan girl who I know, who dreams of leaving Gaza one day and becoming a ballet dancer. And I think to myself, the future that we want to seek is one in which Palestinian girl and Israeli girls have the ability to dream extraordinary lives, not just the ordinary lives we're fighting to achieve today by going to school without having to worry about rockets or bullets. So connect with the 7 and 5-year-old girls who are in Gaza living under siege, listen to their stories, and understand that the ordinary life you live today is extraordinary to the Palestinian girls and women right now.
About you, Rana, what message would you have for the next generation of girls?
I feel that we are using actually now our positions to actually promote the cause and what we are doing for the future generation. And actually this year we should expect, and it should happen, that we should see more women in the leadership roles. And I hope like these young girls in the future will be supported by their families, their career journeys, and they will be also in leadership roles. And maybe their paths will be easier than the ones that we had at this time. And just by their support of their families so that they can reach these levels of leadership. That's all.
So a quick follow-up came in just for that question of a couple times it was mentioned to share the stories of Palestinian women and girls. And so the question is, how do you find those stories? That just came into the chat box as a follow-up to this. Rawan, can you unmute? There we go.
Go to newstoryleadership.org, our website, and you'll find a wall of stories that has a series of Palestinian women activists who have shared their experiences. I would say social media as well. We've seen Sheikh Jarrah Munal Kurd, the East Jerusalemite, who used social media to launch an entire movement online. Engage in social media, search the Tala'at feminist movement that's based in Palestine, and find those activists online, because we exist, but your social media algorithm is currently not set to show you their faces.
Go also to ALLMEP website. We have the storytelling project and the podcast project that features women in the field, bringing their voices and stories and promote them. Even when it's very difficult sometimes to promote them, it's important to promote these stories and make them the mainstream stories.
Thank you. And I will also invite you to visit our website, Combatants for Peace, and for American Friends for Combatants for Peace and check our events and our programs and try to support them and join our future events regularly. So thank you for coming also today.
And when COVID is out of the picture and you visit the Holy Land, look for the holy women in the Holy Land and listen to their stories. They will be very, very open to engaging with you guys.
Yeah, and there are other films and resources out there. An organization called Just Vision put out a film called Nyla and the Uprising. We're hoping that they would be on this call, so maybe we'll have to do another one with them. All about the history of women in the Palestinian resistance and in the nonviolent activism. So there are resources out there. So you can also feel free to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to connect you to more. The three of you guys just took over my conclusion there, all about, get in touch with us. We have three amazing women who represent three amazing NGOs in the field. Rana from Combatants for Peace, Rawan from New Story Leadership, and Huda from ALLMEP. All three NGOs doing really amazing work. So please do stay in touch with us. If you can support us, we very much appreciate that. Our movements and our movement runs on the generosity of people like you all around the world. So it really does make an impact. And we look forward to staying in touch. So thank you all so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.